Welcome to Resolutions, the official podcast of the American Bar Association section of dispute resolution. Every episode is a journey into the heart of conflict resolution, guided by our diverse community of experts. We're here to explore innovative strategies, share wisdom from the field, and inspire excellence in resolving disputes. Whether you're a dispute resolution professional, a curious learner, or someone passionate about fostering understanding and peace, you're in the right place. Let's dive into today's conversation and discover how we can transform conflict into opportunity together.
Well, Loraleigh, Keashly, and Shannon Lynn Burton, welcome to Resolution. Yeah. I know that our listeners are very well educated in the field of dispute resolution, and yet I suspect that someone will hear this podcast and think, I'm not entirely sure what an ombuds even is. Can we start there? Can we just help folks understand what we even mean when we say ombuds? And I know we're talking about a bunch of different contexts and roles, but can you both kind of address the kind of work we're talking about when we say ombuds?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and take that. This is Shannon. When we talk about ombuds, what it means is typically it's a designated neutral that helps to resolve conflict. For the context of the book, we focused primarily on organizational ombuds. So these would be ombuds within organizations. And our mandate is really twofold. It is on one side, that conflict resolution piece, but on the other side, it's that systems piece and using the trends and the patterns that we see on the conflict resolution side to inform our organization.
One of the great things about the book I guess partly it's great that you've written the book. First of all, it appears that in 2025, we didn't quite have such a book, and that's of interest. But then separately, you do a great job early on in sort of tracing the best you can the history of this profession, if I can, put it that way. And I was shocked to hear that it had some distant Chinese roots, as well as being constitutionally written into some Scandinavian law. Can you just talk a little bit about some of those origins?
Yeah, certainly. So the origins of the field, I think in our modern context, we really see it rooted in the Swedish space, what we call our modern day version. The ones that you referenced back from China, as well as kind of the Ottoman Empire, were early precursors to what we would call the modern day ombuds. And in fact, I would say you could almost trace our modern day ombuds concept back to the Ottoman Empire because of King Charles's time that he spent there. But it really started in the Swedish government to be an entity that addressed issues of misconduct and malfeasance in government officials. And then that kind of flowed from Sweden into some of the other Nordic countries and into New Zealand. And New Zealand kind of took it a step further in terms of the space around it was to be a report to the parliament, to the people itself. And then from New Zealand, it ended up in Canada and then into the US. In each iteration, it took on some nuances of its culture and the country that it was in, to where we see it here in the States today emerging in colleges and universities in the late 60s, early 70s.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you have a sense for why it might have had some appeal in a governmental context elsewhere and has struggled, at least at the federal level in the US, to gain that kind of traction. You make reference to a couple of efforts to federalize or to create some, what I'll call national ombuds. Do you have any thoughts as to what differentiates us in this context from some of those others?
Yeah, I think that's a study that has yet to be done, actually, as to why that is the case. I think one of the things around our field that I think both Loraleigh and I speak to in the book is that it is an under-researched field. And so one of the reasons for writing this book was to really get people engaged in that space, to help us create that kind of knowledge base for what ombuds are and what they do and kind of what our history is. There's still a lot we don't know around why it took root in the ways that it took root. One of my kind of passion projects that I go down the path of every now and again is looking at Eastern Montana College, which was our very first ombuds office here in the States, trying to figure out why this small college in Montana created an ombuds office. And I have yet to find the answer to that. So I think that's part of it, right? Is that there's still a lot of unknown questions as to why it maybe didn't take root here in the federal space. We do have federal ombuds, though. I do want to note that there are a number of agencies that do have federal ombuds that work in an organizational capacity with their employees and in some cases with constituents outside their organizations.
I should also say, as someone who vacationed in Montana, there's a lot I still don't understand about Montana. As wonderful as it was for our Montana listeners, it was a great vacation. But I think in your last answer, you sort of alluded to something I want to get to, which is it feels as if the use of the term ombuds has been taken to mean a lot of different things, both in terms of the context in which they work and the nature of their employment status, right? I mean, they could be in-house, they could be contracted and so on, but also their actual function. So, I mean, first of all, I think it'd be helpful if you all could just explain how ombuds function differently in different contexts. I know you talk about classical settings and other investigative settings, but also your thoughts on should there be alternative terminology? Should we continue to say ombuds when we're talking about such different roles, or at least in my estimation, such different roles that the professional is playing?
So I think, in my opinion, Larry, this is Shannon again, that I do think ombuds, the term ombuds really speaks to a specific role, right? It is this independent role where we sit outside all of those formal structures, we sit outside all of the systems. So it isn't just so we're navigating the conflict resolution piece, it's so we can kind of question the systems and the fairness and how others are treated in that space. I think what you're talking about in terms of where we see it kind of emerging differently, right, in a lot of spaces is that I think because there has been so little research done, especially in the theory space around ombuds, that the conflict resolution space gets conflated with the term ombud. So they think an ombuds person is just someone who does conflict resolution within an organization. That this piece about us being independent so that we can question the system, I think is a piece that often gets overlooked. So I think that's why we see these different iterations of the word ombuds or people co-opting the term ombuds, is because there is a lack of understanding of the system side of the work.
And Professor Keashly, if I'm not mistaken, I think some of the research that you've done is in the space of understanding why people will consult with someone like an ombuds to address organizational challenges or to address issues that are happening inside their organization. And I wonder how you see this question of what it means to say I'm working with an ombuds, or what can an ombuds most effectively do for an organization that it's serving across a multitude of different functions?
Well, I'll talk from the context of being in academia because that's been my organization for my entire career, and it's also where a lot of my research is. One of the things that I've seen happen is that people do have different ideas about what an ombuds, and I think Shannon is dead on in terms of they often conflate with being a mediator or an arbitrator, especially in universities, especially with faculty, because that's the group that I work the most with. They do understand this notion of systemic. And they do understand the notion of patterning. So while it may be an individual who feels like I have this issue with this dean or with this staff or something like that, they're also trained to look at patterns. And they recognize that a pattern requires some kind of systemic intervention. And it's in that context I hear them use words like ombud. So on some level, while they may not be able to clearly articulate why they know it, they know that that kind of position, because it's independent, it's informal, it's neutral in that place, suggests that they should be able to comment on the systemic pieces of it. They also tend to see it as a tool. They do recognize that if you actually have somebody in the space that Shannon has defined as the way that we talk about it, they, as individuals and as groups, have a better chance of being able to have some kind of influence on the organizational structure, the management, the administration, to actually, it raises the attention of the issue. So things are not being sometimes dismissed. Oh, this is just to individuals. That's their thing. After a period of time, if you see the same kind of thing happening, regardless of who's sitting in these roles, that says that there's something systemic. So I do think, at least in universities, and particularly among faculty, they do see that ombuds as a systemic role. Now, does that mean every university operationalizes it that way? And I would say no. They focus very much on the conflict part of it, and they don't want to hear from the person in that position about the patterns that are seen and the implications for the organization.
And I think that this gets to a question I wanted to ask you both about, the nature of the employment of the ombuds or their appointment, because it would seem to me that on the one hand, if someone is a formal part of an organizational chart or structure, that they are potentially more likely to have influence with the highest levels of the administration, and it sends a message as to how seriously that organization may take the role. At the same time, if I'm someone who wants to seek the ombuds support for something, I may be more anxious if I see that the ombuds is directly reporting to the president, the CEO, what have you, and the independence as a contractor or something else might be very attractive. So I know Shannon said at the beginning, there's not enough research here, so we don't necessarily know, but what are your two thoughts about how these different kinds of appointments may impact the organizations they serve, the people who request their services, that sort of thing?
Yeah, this is Shannon again. I think in terms of looking at kind of external contractors versus those of us that are internal to our organizations, those of us that are internal, and I serve in both capacities. So I am internal here at Michigan State University, and I'm a contracted ombuds with the American Educational Research Association. So I get to kind of look at the role from both lenses in terms of how we function. Internally, I think one of the benefits that an internal ombuds has is that they've in some ways have an opportunity to really get to know the organization well, get to understand kind of how it functions, where the relationships are, so that they're better positioned to help individuals who seek their support navigate the system, right? Because we have a deep knowledge and understanding of the system is how I would put it. I think externally, there is this lens that if you're external to the organization, you're more likely to be independent because you don't have previous relationships with the university. So I think it really depends on kind of what your perspective on trust is, right? At MSU, I've grown up here professionally at MSU and was moved in as an assistant ombuds initially, so was able to build that trust over the years. And I think I was put into this office because individuals here on campus trusted me. So I think I had built that trust over many, many years. But I can also see with my work at the AERA, where me being external to the organization, but still understanding the organization, but understanding it differently, provides some level of trust.
Loraleigh, anything you'd like to add?
Shannon, I think you articulated that very well, that it's a series of tensions about how you try to do that. I think the idea about trust is a really core part of it and how people think about it. So I think Shannon nailed it when she talked about that in particular. Yeah.
I want to come back to this idea of an ombuds who is addressing something that's more than a single episode, because I think that that's something that will be somewhat new to folks who aren't as familiar with the profession. And I don't have to tell the two of you or our audience that we're living in an age, whether it be in higher ed, whether it be in government service, whether it be in the private sector, the nonprofit, of just tremendous upheaval for one reason or another. It would initially just be helpful to understand from both of you, like, what can an ombuds in the best of circumstances do about these kinds of upheavals? For example, can a higher ed ombuds do something to try to address faculty turnover at many universities in the wake of some of the issues higher ed is facing? Or can an ombuds do something about discord amongst government employees for one reason or another? Where is the ombuds place in some of those kinds of things?
There is a framework that we talk about in the book that was written by Raines and Harrison, which talks about the hierarchy of tasks of an ombuds. And I think that's a really good way to kind of view the work of an ombud. So at the base of that hierarchy, you have the one-on-one work that we do, the conflict coaching. So as I think about this moment in time, right, if an individual is coming in with a concern related to maybe civility or an issue of being laid off because of what's happening, our role first and foremost as an ombuds is to listen to that individual and make sure that they're feeling heard within the organization and coaching them through that moment in time. Where are the supports in the organization for them? What are some ways that they might be able to reframe? What are some ways that they might be able to think about differently? The next level up on that is the kind of group facilitation work that we do. So that might look like doing a mediation, but it also might look like facilitating some kind of restorative circle. And as you talk about discord within a unit around an issue, right, that might be a space where we come in and do that group facilitation piece. Then the next level up on that is the space where we do training and workshops. So as we kind of move up this hierarchy, we're moving from a space of being reactive to conflict, which is, I think, what our nature to be more proactive. So that next level up around training and workshops is the ability for us as ombuds to really go in and build the capacity within our organizations for healthy conflict and healthy conversations. And then as we're continuing to kind of move up that hierarchy, the next one up there is looking at kind of how we construct our conflict resolution systems within the organization. And for me, what that kind of looks like isn't just conflict resolution, it's looking at our policies and processes as an organization. How are we treating individuals fairly? What does that look like in terms of their dignity as human beings, right? And so that's kind of where I would say it's more than just the conflict resolution system, it's looking at it through that fairness lens. And then as we kind of continue to move up that hierarchy, we have things like coaching senior leadership, right, around the value of the humanity of the people that we work with, the people that we serve, as well as coaching them around what does fairness look like if you're a leader within that organization. And at the top level, we have the systems change piece. And as I think of systems change, that might be something where as an ombuds, I'm looking at a pattern over a number of years around a particular issue within my organization and saying, I'm writing not only in my annual report that this is an issue that the organization needs to respond to or should respond to, and here are my suggestions for how the organization responds. But it might also be writing a white paper that looks more in depth and provide more kind of meat, as it were, right, around the issue so that the organization can respond differently moving forward. Mm-hmm. So I think in these times, it depends on whether an organization is looking to be reactive or they're looking to be proactive in their work.
And I would imagine you might be willing to attach yourself to a metaphor that I've used, which is carrying over from healthcare and medicine, this idea, right, that, you know, we spend so much more money and endure so much more of a struggle if we get treated in an emergency room as opposed to having regular checkups, which I see as proactive and preventative.
It does.
There's something else that's of interest to me, and then I want to get to some kind of stories from your work here. One of the other things that interests me is the significance of an ombuds's subject matter expertise, which could also become bias. What I'm thinking of specifically is there was a position open in my university for ombuds for some time, and it became clear, faculty, it became clear that it was reserved for tenure track. And partly that was due to the fact that so many of the disputes themselves involved the tenure process. And so the question I'm really interested in is, how do the two of you think about a potential balance between subject matter expertise, which of course none of us would oppose someone having, versus I'm filtering this person in my office's experience through my own experience, whatever that may be. And of course, the best ombuds can do their work by suppressing their biases, which we all have. But it just strikes me that there's a little bit of a fine line or a tightrope to walk there, both in terms of relating to what the person might be dealing with, but also trying not to conflate it with your own experience, if that makes sense.
And we do have several chapters which will reflect on these kinds of issues that for ombuds in their roles and how they play, and being aware of their own sort of story, the stuff they bring to the party, so to speak, and staying focused on, so when do we use our subject matter expertise beyond what we know about conflict resolution and system analysis design and what my background, for example, is a psychologist. And so what are the things that I'm going to tend to focus on? Whereas if I were coming from it from the perspective of, say, someone from a STEM discipline, like physics and things like that, how might they choose to look at that? I think one of the things that's, for me, that has been helpful in thinking about this has been what I've pulled from the conflict resolution approach, which is that a lot of the expertise that an ombuds has is process expertise as opposed to content, a content about the specific issue somebody's bringing. Focusing on that helps remind me, especially if I'm helping people do things, about what they need to do. What's the process of that, as opposed to because I've got a specialty in workplace bullying that I'm the ombuds that you want to deal with because I've done a lot of the research in it and stuff like that. No. I think I'd want an ombuds who maybe has an understanding about that stuff showing up. And if they know their organization, they probably do. I mean, in fact, it's from ombuds that we get a lot of information in the early days of that whole work on workplace bullying in the academy that was phenomenal in setting the stage for it. But is in focusing on that process. But you're right that ombuds need to be very cognizant of who they are in this role and what are the things that they're more likely to see and things that they're less likely to see. And so I think we have a few pieces where the writers are actually reflecting on that. Shannon, what do you think?
Yeah, and I think I would add to that too, with that particular example you gave where it was reserved for a tenure track thing. I think that really reflects kind of some of the history of the field and kind of where the field has become more professionalized in recent years. Here at MSU, it was only a tenure stream faculty member that could hold this position. And it was only 12 years ago, maybe 11 years ago, where that shifted where it now states tenure track, senior tenure stream, or other qualified individual in terms of who can hold the position under policy, kind of recognizing that this field has professionalized. So I'm the first non-tenure track individual to hold this role. So I think that's one of the things too that we're seeing reflected is that the field is becoming more professionalized as the years progress. It isn't just like I think about our very first ombuds in 1967, who was a former dean in the College of Arts and Letters, was a faculty member in the Department of English. But each of my predecessors has brought something different to their role based on their perspective, right? But I think one of the benefits we have as a field is that we often come together to talk about some of the cases and even kind of reflect on things together. Here in our office, we have the good fortune to have more than one. I have an assistant ombuds that I can, as we say, noodle cases with, right? So we're making sure that we're thinking through where our biases might be. But I do think as ombuds, we do spend time in that reflection, thinking about how is my own history with conflict or my own history within the organization, maybe coloring the way that this is coming through to me at this moment.
I want to jump off of what you both shared there, and particularly Loraleig's notion of having an ombuds do some self-reflection and just ask, either from your own experiences or from an experience you share in the book, for an interesting episode in an ombud's career in which they really had to grapple with kind of their own identity, their own experiences, while also wanting to serve either a person or an organization in a really critical moment. So sort of balancing on a tightrope between what they may be bringing to the episode or the trend alongside the significant need for some intervention on their part.
So I can talk a little bit, I think, as an example, right? Many know that we had a shooting here on campus in 2023, right? And as an office, we saw visitors that were impacted by that event. And I think one of the things that's important to recognize here is that we too were impacted by that event and impacted in a number of ways, not only as employees of the institution. Not only did I have to think about what my response was as an employee and how that was impacting the cases that I was seeing related to that, but I also have a number of other identities related. I'm an alumni of MSU, so it impacted me that way. I'm a supervisor of my staff, so I was also in this space of having to navigate supporting my staff while supporting our visitors. And then I would also say another piece of that is that I'm also a Spartan parent. Like I have a child who attends MSU, right? And so needed to also parse out that identity as I was dealing with these issues as they were coming into campus. And so sometimes I think when we talk about kind of grappling with our own identity, it may not be something you ever thought about happening within your organization, and then really needing to think through that in the moment and what does this look like. So not only was I trying to support the visitors and the greater campus community around a trauma-informed response to that incident, but also trying to navigate my own feelings around what had happened here on campus, my staff's feelings around what was happening on campus, and my feelings as a mother and my own students' experiences with it. So I think that would be an example of like in the moment, like where as an ombuds, we have to kind of process and in some ways compartmentalize what we're seeing and what we're experiencing.
Well, and I was going to say, I mean, it didn't cause you to desist from serving in your role,
No.
as I think some of our neutrals might be inclined to do, not, of course, in such a horrific tragedy. I mean, none of us experience what you had to experience. Many of us might think, oh, I'm so personally connected to something, I should not get involved. And I think this isn't a case where you were that much more needed, perhaps, in spite of, or in addition to, or
Absolutely.
in context of that relationship. That's a very interesting example. I appreciate you sharing it. Let me turn to a slightly more positive example, or ask you for one, again, from either the book or your experiences, where it just drove home to you why we need ombuds, whether it be helping a specific person, helping a specific organization, and you just thought, I'm able to do something in this instance or with this trend that would be hard to do from just about any other organizational role or perch.
Yeah. I think if you talk to most ombuds, what they'll tell you is they have the stories from individuals that'll be like, wow, this is the first place that I've ever felt heard. It may not be like we're seeing their situation be resolved, because sometimes resolution may mean there isn't necessarily a resolution, but it's helping, making them feel like they've been seen, making them feel like they've gotten some dignity, and making them feel like they've been heard, right? And I think every ombuds has a story like that, where someone says, gee, this is the first time I've ever been heard by anybody. And I think that in itself is like one of those moments that we see the impact of in ombuds. To move it kind of to more quantitative space, right? There's a number of ombuds that also will do evaluations with their visitors. And one of the questions we often ask visitors, at least, is, what is something you would have done had you not consulted with the ombuds office? And there are things like hiring an attorney, resigned from my position, withdrawn from school, in my case at a university, dropped a class, not done anything at all, and just sat and festered in this space of discontent. So many of us do have kind of indicators of how maybe we've prevented a student from dropping out or an employee from leaving our organization, and been able to help them navigate something in a way that's been more positive than what it was.
I know that you devote some significant ink or print to thinking about where ombuds can be even additionally useful in the future. And I'd love for you to speak to that, which isn't to say that any of its current functions would go obsolete, or at least I don't think they will. What are some ways you think we could see an expansion of the way that ombuds serve an individual, an organization, or even the public?
I'm looking at you, Shannon, because this is the forward-thinking chapter.
So in 2017, I wrote an article called Ombudsing in the New Era that really talked about an ombud's ability to be able to support individuals in conflict in ways that maybe others can't, right? Because we have this big toolbox that we can pull from, and we have this understanding of our organizations that others don't, that I think we have more opportunity, more flexibility to be in spaces. One of our colleagues a number of years ago at an IOA conference called us as individuals working in a liminal space, right? We're the in-between. And I think that's, as we think about kind of moving forward in the field, I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to support our organizations as they're navigating new contexts, as they're navigating new challenges. If anything's a constant, it's change. And I think as ombuds, because we've come to know our organizations and know where the bends and turns are in our organizations, we're in a space where we can better highlight where, as we look at these changes, how the organization might better respond to them, I think, while paying attention to how individuals are treated and paying attention to their humanity and their dignity as individuals.
Obviously, we hear from listeners who work in the field, and I'm, of course, categorizing the field with a very big tent. You know, there are lots of different kinds of folks working in either dispute resolution or third-party neutral kinds of work. But for someone who hasn't really gotten exposed directly, either as a client or as a practitioner, to ombuds work, but who is kind of already in the fold a little bit, I guess it's a two-part question. I mean, one, what do you want a dispute resolution professional or professional neutral to know or to think about when it comes to ombuds? And two, how can folks not working in ombuds maybe support ombuds or help the ombuds field in some way to advance?
I'll try the second part of your question, since I'm not an ombuds. And the phrase that Shannon used with me, I'm ombuds adjacent. And somebody who does research and some practice in helping people manage conflict and negotiate different kinds of, and navigate different kinds of situations. I mean, I just remember the profound insight I had as I started working in research and bullying in organizations, and I've been doing that for a long time, and coming across what the university ombuds were already doing with it. And I'm like, whoa, these folks really know that they know what's happening in their organization. They may talk about it in a somewhat different way, but it's the same kind of thing. And so as someone, I reached out to ombuds and I started talking to them about, you're talking about these kinds of things. And guess what? I talk about it in this way. And I'm wondering if there's some way. So those identifying those shared interests, I also think this book is particularly I'm thinking again in a university context, it's going to be a powerful influence on faculty, because faculty play with, research and writing and all of that other type of stuff. And this book brings together a variety of different perspectives, weaves in some research, weaves in some theory, so that it will deepen their understanding about what an ombuds can do and what an ombud should be allowed to do and what's possible for that to happen. So I think then that builds credibility. But one of the things we found, Shannon, in some of the folks who were reviewing the research and whatnot, is a lot of it's been done by people from outside, so the profession. So there are people who are very interested in this, right? And so the possibility of the partnership with people who are actually practicing ombuds becomes much more profound. And as Shannon also pointed out, the idea of trust within an organization, when you have an ombuds who has a record of being helpful to employees, being helpful to the organization, then that draws people in too. And so I think this book is actually going to do a lot in terms of for people from outside, but who have related interests, to be able to start to see ways they might want to connect. And at very least, they have names for people they can reach out to and start asking questions about.
Yeah, I think that's one of the real strengths of the book, right? Is that we have had books about ombuds in the past, but those books have been written either from someone outside of the field, or they've been written to kind of make a business case for creating an ombuds office. I think what makes this book really unique in this space is that it was really meant to be a support for ombuds themselves, or people coming into the field that are maybe coming from outside of the field, and how do you have to think differently. I know one of the conversations that I've had with ombuds over the years is that, like, that transition in identity from, like, if you've been a part of the organization in the past in a different role, how do you navigate that shift in identity to now being a neutral within that organization? I know relationships change. I know my relationships changed as I moved into the ombuds role. Some of it has been like, maybe they've been in a position where, like, they were part of a formal process in the past, and people come with the expectation that the ombuds is going to fix it because of that individual's background and history. And so helping them kind of navigate those conversations and that shift in identity, I think, is a really important piece of it. And I hope that this book contributes to that. I think the other piece around that the book that's really important is that it's written by over 40 of us, right? It's the first time you kind of have this coming together of a multitude of ombuds voices to talk about the work that they do and how they do it. And I think that's something that's brand new that this offers kind of the dispute resolution field is like, let's talk about how ombuds view their work. And, there's ombuds from the corporate sector, ombuds from the governmental sector, ombuds from the educational sector that were authors in this book. We have ombuds that have been in the field for years, some just a couple years. We have ombuds that are international, right? Canada, Portugal, and a couple other international colleagues that have contributed to this book as well. So I hope this is something that continues to grow, is that we as a field start talking more comprehensively about our work than we have in the past.
And as someone who's outside the professional field, for myself, this is Loraleigh, having a book like that is really, it gives me an insider's look, right? In that moment, I get to see how they think about themselves, but it also educates me a great deal. And then to the extent that I feel a connection or I think I could have something to offer, I can reach out to that. So hearing the voices and hearing the range of voices and the range of experiences. So even though we're defining a field and a profession and how it might be different than other kinds of things, there's still this incredibly rich range and texture of how this work actually gets done. And I think that means it could be attractive to not just for people who want to become ombuds, but for them to understand what that is and therefore how they might be able to connect to it. Like, how can I be helpful here in this circumstance?
Well, unquestionably, the book is quite helpful to all of us. It's the Organizational Ombuds, Foundations, Fundamentals, and Its Future, edited by our guests today, Doctors Shannon Lynn Burton and Loraleigh Keashly. Thank you both so much for joining us on Resolutions.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Resolutions. Today's episode has illuminated the powerful impact of effective dispute resolution and showcased the incredible individuals who dedicate themselves to this important work. Our mission is to explore the diverse world of dispute resolution, and we hope we've inspired you to engage with conflict and collaboration in new ways. If you're not yet a member of the ABA section of dispute resolution, we invite you to join our community of professionals making a difference. Your involvement can help us build a more harmonious society together. And if you found value in our conversations, please consider leaving us a review and a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback helps us reach more people and continue our journey towards excellence in dispute resolution. Until next time, keep solving problems, building bridges, and creating positive changes in your communities.